to hand this mic and the Cinema's Lifetime Achievement Award of 2019 to the woman that brought us all together here tonight. Please give a huge round of applause for Lindsay Wagner.
Stuck in traffic, and I cut out parts of the speech. I should talk longer. For the award to arrive.
All right. Well,
there it comes. Oh. Here it comes. Another round of applause for the award.
Der Typ, der Alte, ist echt eine Note.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming out of the closet to the public for a few minutes. I don't know what to say. This is lovely. This is lovely. Historically, this was given to people after they died. But like I said, I'm not finished yet. It's just been such an incredible journey. How many people here don't speak English? I guess that's a funny question to ask because you wouldn't know what I'm saying. What'd she say? She said, does anybody not speak English? I'm just wondering if you find it valuable or not to have somebody translate. I just want to ask the coordinators. Anybody? No? All right. Here we go.
Braucht jemand Übersetzung?
Braucht jemand Übersetzung?
No. Wenn ja, ist es eh schon zu spät.
Seid
No
ehrlich.
translation needed.
Oh,
Seid
okay.
ehrlich, Leute.
Okay, then. Thank you. Thank you. This is really lovely. It was great to be able to come here, and sadly, this is my first trip to Germany, and I'm not going to get to see much, but I'm glad I got at least to see you. And it was funny when they told me that this town was built by and for, and still the heart of it is the Volkswagen. That was the car that I learned to drive a stick shift in. A little old Beetle, what we call the Beetle, the little Beetle car. And it was terrifying because the reason I was driving it, we were at a theater, I'm maybe 16 years old. We were at a rehearsal at a theater that was kind of out in the woods. And my girlfriend broke her leg tripping off the stage. And she had a Beetle, and I had been dropped off at the theater. So that was the car. And I had to figure out how to drive that Beetle with her moaning in pain in the passenger seat and still trying to tell me what to do. No, that foot, no, this foot. Oh my God, it was crazy. That was my first introduction to the Volkswagen. And so for a Lifetime Achievement Award, I have that as part of one of them, that we made it to the hospital alive.
Excuse me, how old were you?
16. I just had my license. Yeah. What would you like to know about? So much to say. So, anybody have any questions that you would like to ask? Yes.
Linda Carter made a statement about the Me Too movement, and because you were the first woman who basically had her own series to star in, I would like maybe for you to talk about your experience, because you know all of this like really ugly stuff, struggle stuff that women have to deal with every day is now coming out. And did you have it easier, or did you just have wonderful people? Because I noticed that you haven't had like the complaints that some of the other actresses and actors have had.
I think for me it wasn't, I definitely had experiences, but interestingly enough, it was not in the business.
Okay.
My parents, my mother was quite a character, and my grandmother, her mother, and they were some pretty tough cookies. So it just didn't happen in the business. Another thing that I think perhaps protected me in that way in business was that I was so famous so quick that I wasn't in the business a long time, having to struggle, I must say. It was, my entrance into the industry was very unusual. I studied acting when I was a kid. I started studying when I was 12 and 13, 14. Those years with James Best. I used to babysit for them, and the reason that I started acting was not because I was even interested in it, to be honest with you. His wife was a ballerina, and he was an actor and a coach. And in those days, we still had the studio system, where, you know what that means, it's when people were under contract to a studio as opposed to freelance. And if someone wanted to hire you that was making a film at a different studio, they had to basically buy you from the studio, because in essence they owned you professionally for a period of time. And so it was the very end of that system when I came into the business. I was studying with Jimmy back then, and the studios used to send out talent scouts to places that, such as Jimmy's class, which was, it was for working actors to continue studying while they worked, so they weren't in classes where they had to deal with a lot of the people. But a lot of them were television stars already, but they wanted to keep doing, because when you get in a television series, you're often playing the same character all the time, right? And so you kind of lose your muscles, if you, especially the younger ones, to be something different. And they enjoyed that. And also, and so they would do different characters, do different scenes, work them up, and do a showcase, it was called. And the scouts would come to see the showcases. They would be advertised, and scouts would come. And a lot of people got jobs that way. So in babysitting for Jimmy, as a kid, we had a lot of family problems, like a lot of people. And I had, one of my coping mechanisms to deal with my pain was to be funny, to be entertaining. And so the more I hurt, the funnier I would get. And being artists, Jimmy and Jody, his wife, sensitive people, I didn't fool them at all. And they saw what was happening, that I was working a lot to help my family and whatnot, and I really just never did anything kids do. So they said, why don't you, we didn't have much money, so she said, why don't you come into my ballet class? And I said, oh, no. And she said, no, it's okay. You can just do a couple extra jobs for us when you work it out. Okay, so I tried it. I did not know, nobody knew back then what dyslexia was. I was very dyslexic. And I found out about it many years later, and part of that for me was sequencing. So I was poised, I was strong, I could do the moves and all that, but then, after we learned all of that, had to learn to put the dance together. So do 3 of these, 1 of these, 2 of these, pirouette, and start the sequence over again. It was a nightmare for me. I didn't know that I didn't. And I knew that I was always kind of faking my way through school. And the reading part of the problem was I couldn't track the things. And so putting all that together, they realized that they were making me feel worse about myself because now here's something else I can't do. So over their pillow talk, I think they decided that he was going to try and bring me into his acting class because they wanted to give me a place where I could express myself with honesty, express pain, express all of myself, not just my vitality and humor. And so for me, and I went into it, I went, and then I realized when I got in there, there's like all these people I watch on TV, and it's like, oh my God, what am I doing here? And he had mentioned to them that he was bringing a kid into the class. I was 12. And so he gave me a film, for a one-act play to do, which people who study the theater, Tennessee Williams, This Property is Condemned. And it's a story about a young girl whose family's all disappeared and she's trying to stay alive on her own and whatnot. At the end of all of us working, and it was like a duck to water for me, it was just like, he gave me this, I could play the sadness, I could play the fear, I could play covering up my, which is what I did all the time, covering up my feelings. And when we put on the showcase, as it turned out, I was the only one that got an offer for a job. And they were all going, hey, wait a minute, get this kid out of here. But for me, it was the beginning of learning about myself. It was so profound for me. And I could do it. I could show you my pain. I could empathize with this girl and know what I felt and express it through that character and let people see it because my name wasn't on it. I mean, I understood this about myself years later, right? And he would teach acting by having us observe people and look at what we were reacting to in people. People watch. I mean, actors, they do that, but people watch, right? But he would then come back and say, tell me about the people watching you did. Tell me who you saw. I want to know what you saw that caused you to feel either repulsed or want to look away, or what attracted you, or you found yourself judging someone. Talk to me about that. And that was our homework, was to come in and talk about that. He said, because if you can't, you're not going to be able to play anything but yourself when you go into acting if you don't learn to embrace and deal with the things that you see in other people that you don't like. Because if you have to play that person, you will resist going there because of your self-image. You know, you won't want to be seen that way. And so, in a way, he was like teaching acting, like they teach consciousness classes today about judgment and so judging yourself, judging others. And so he kept opening us up more and more, which gave me again another confidence, you know, a certain kind of confidence that was unusual then and certainly unusual for women. So I had the women in my family, which were very strong in lots of ways. And Jimmy's teaching. So I think in a lot of ways, and then of course becoming famous right away, I think people are a predator is less apt to approach you if you don't really need anything from them. Do you know what I'm saying? I think that's part of what makes people vulnerable. Does that make sense?
When you're at the top of the food chain.
Hmm?
You're at the top of the food chain.
Yeah, but it's not about being at the top of the food chain. It's about the fact that a predator looks for someone that they can get a hold of in some way. You know? And plus I played a bionic woman, so maybe they bought into it. Who knows? So it's just you know, I was blessed in that way. And not that I didn't experience it outside prior to, and even sometimes afterwards, but not in business. So, and I know I was very,
No, you're lucky. You're
I
so
know,
lucky.
blessed, I know.
Just very blessed.
Yeah, and I think also playing parts. It was a whole time when women were trying to come out of the roles of being in the kitchen and doing all of that. Well, for me in the industry, I was very I didn't like what happened in that time period of the women's. It was the women's movement, and the Bionic Woman was really the first one to break out of that mold. But and people were following, but for me, from my perspective, in all honesty, I felt wasn't happy with a lot of the things that came out afterwards, because they were trying to say, see me as a person, a whole person, woman, yes I'm woman, yes I'm feminine, but let's get inside here, in the head, in the heart, let's talk about that, let's express that. And it seemed like the pendulum swung the other way. That it was like, okay, we're getting out of the mom in the kitchen with the pinafore and buttoned up to here, and now we're taking it out. Now we're saying we're strong and woman, and we're putting on push-up bras, and we're selling the sexuality. And it was like, well, that's not it either. Where is this balance? I think we're all still trying to find it. What is the strong woman? For me, it starts in the heart. If you got a body, sure, use it as well. But it's not. For those of you who are young and didn't go through that transitional period, it's a whole different world. I think you see things differently in some ways, or don't think about certain things because in a way you don't really know what we were breaking out of. And that's not a bad thing. I'm just saying that I would like people, everyone, to remember that it's like, a huge ship, global culture, female, male culture, relations. It's like trying to turn the biggest cruise ship ever. And it's gonna take time, and it's really good that, and everything else in our system, our phones go faster, our computers go faster, everything's going fast, everything is throwaway, and yet this relationship between men and women, it's turning, and it's requiring everyone, including the women, in my opinion, to go inside and really, we know what we want, or do we? We know what we want, how we want to be treated, but look at how you treat yourself, look at what you're putting out there, and not that I'm not saying anything excuses any kind of abuse, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that if we need to maintain a sense of compassion for everyone. I have worked in the jails with domestic violence offenders in the kind of spiritual work and health, holistic healing type work that I do. And it's been an amazing experience having grown up with that in the family. And when you have compassion for everyone, yes, you have to say stop, no, but at the same time, understand that person's been acculturated and bruised. People who hurt have been hurt. Again, doesn't excuse anybody's behavior, but if we keep trying to push this ship a different direction with compassion, with understanding that we're all trying to learn and grow and recreate something that we haven't had before as a culture. There's no guidebook for this, Get me on the subject. You shouldn't ever get me on this subject. But anyway, all I can say is incorporate compassion when you're looking at this, when you're making decisions, hold your boundaries firm. But maintain that compassion, because we're all in this crazy turning time, and none of us really know where we're going to end up. But all we can do is from the heart be honest and that the cue to go off? They do that at the Emmys, you know. They do that at the Oscars. And after that, they kind of stand backstage. Anyway, anything else about film?
Was for you being an actress? If I understand, being an actress was a kind when you were very young. Was it kind for you? Was it kind of introspective process because you were able to express different emotions that maybe in the real life you wasn't able maybe to express? Was a kind of an introspective
when I was studying
process,
acting?
and you were maybe trying to show the people through your acting, okay, let's express ourselves, let the soul, our soul, we have to talk with our soul, but not only with our mind. It was the process you were starting on when you were very young?
Yes. So when I went into acting, it was kind of different for me. And I went into it because I really believed in television being a powerful, powerful medium. And we absolutely know that today, big time. We're all being indoctrinated by it, by all the political parties and people selling things and, you know, whatever. It's like, ugh. They figured it out long before the audience did. But yes, that was the beginning of my really learning about self-awareness. It wasn't a typical, maybe some teachers did teach it. I just would hear other actors talk about what they were studying, and I thought, that's more about creating a character rather than finding a character. Sometimes it felt like that to me, the different way different people would teach. But, you know, that was what I learned. That's what happened in my life. But I went into acting because I wanted to do stories about human issues. And it wasn't possible then. The television shows were able to be on because product companies would supply the money by buying commercials, right? So the sponsors, it's all about, people used to say, oh, the commercials are there so they can make the movies. And it's like, no, the movies are there so commercial people can sell product. And once you start looking at it that way, it's a little different. And so my feeling was, why not use it for our purposes as well? And you couldn't do a movie about child abuse. You couldn't do a movie about domestic violence. You couldn't do any of those things at the time I came into acting because it was too controversial, didn't know how the public would receive it, and therefore they didn't know they didn't want anybody to turn the channel because then the sponsors would not have you see the commercials. But because of, God bless Jamie Summers, I had such a high visibility, such popularity, that the networks would let me try something that other people wouldn't, that they wouldn't let other people try. Because it seemed like anything I did, it was just, really big at that time. And so I would, pardon? The visibility. And we called it a TVQ. That was, I don't know if you use that same term here in other countries, but the TVQ was quotient, the word was quotient. How many people were watching would tune in. And so they let me try things, and they would always work. And in fact, I kept saying, I think you're underestimating the public. I think people want to. It's the time. It was after the 60s, it's just into the 70s now. People are changing, our culture's changing. And so people want this to chew on these subjects. Let's try it in television. So that's how I ended up doing so many, and that's what kept me in the business, was doing stories about social issues. We had revisionist history, child abuse, domestic violence, terrorism. That Willie Erickson story was the first time anything about terrorism was ever on television. And there was a bunch of other things. I can't remember what other subjects we covered right now. No? Yeah, no, but what the other subjects? Anyway, yes?
Was it hard to say goodbye to the bionic woman, or was it immediately that you saw the chance, the opportunity to express yourself in other ways and use your popularity to deliver those messages and those themes to the audience?
Right. Interestingly enough, I'm glad you asked that, because when I came to do the Bionic Woman, part of my contract was that I had a certain type of input into the stories, because number one, I knew we were influencing children, and so I wanted her to be able to solve problems more from a woman's perspective. I didn't want to go in there and be a man in a skirt going, bam, I'm stronger, I win. So I was challenging always the writers to think like a woman, to use inclusiveness, to think compassion. Yeah, that's our enemy, but what does that mean? Here back then it was the Russians. Oh, it's Russians again now for us, but back then it was the Russians and the Cold War, and so I kept saying, I don't want Jamie to see that as the bad guy. This person does what he's doing because he's from a country that does what they do, and they say, this is bad over here. He's being told what we're being told. I'm not saying that we shouldn't go after him and stop him from doing what he's doing, but to demonize constantly the other person is why I think the cycle just keeps going over and over and over, because there's always black and white, right and wrong. There's no ground in between to do anything about it. So when they would write the stories, they started finally coming up with ways other than just the fight that ended the whole thing. And we covered, so that was one thing that I felt we were teaching week after week after week in little subtle ways. Also, the female approach at times. There was a story, if you remember, about this Arab prince who had a son. Some of you may remember that, yeah?
Jamie and the King.
Jamie and the King.
Sorry.
And in which I had to belly dance. She saw that the son was not, wanted to impress his dad, wanted approval from his father, wanted to be like him, but there were things about his dad that he didn't really resonate with. And eventually she gets him to stand up to his father, which ended up helping her be able to help the king better and solve the problem. As a woman, she intuited that about the boy. And so a little different approach than perhaps the typical male hero. Coming in. Stand by here, boy. I'll get him. That kind of thing. And those are old stereotypes. It's changing. I mean, the world really is changing. It's changing. There's some wonderful things coming up. People are waking up all over the place. And I think the more that happens, the more people who have resistance to that are hunkering in. So it seems worse, It's like things get worse before they get better. And I think that's the stage we're in, which can be very uncomfortable. But did I answer your question? Wait, I think I got right onto that without. What did you ask me?
The original question was about saying goodbye to Bionic Woman and transferring.
Oh yeah, okay. So the answer to that is I didn't feel it was a big change, because we've been doing it all along. I mean, we were talking about the other night at dinner. We did a story about it's called biofeedback, and it was a story where one of the scientists went to India studying you probably did that one, didn't you? Did you do that one? Do you all know that this is my voice for the Bionic Woman? It's beautiful. Anyway, the scientist that goes and studies in India how these people pierce themselves and don't bleed and walk on nails and whatever all they do, they've learned mind over matter. And so I wanted to do a story about that for kids to see that. And so they wrote it as biofeedback that this man took and rigged up these yogis when they were doing their thing to the biofeedback machine, and they taught him how to bring himself into a state. He came back and continued his research in the US, and he ended up getting shot, and he was able to calm himself enough to where he didn't bleed to death until they got to him and it was over. So we showed that story, right? There were other stories where we had Charlie Hill, who was a Native American comedian, wonderful, funny guy. At that time, in 1970, would that have been 76, 7, maybe 77, 78? Literally the year before we did this episode, the Native American people, there's a tradition called Sundance. Anybody know about Sundance? Well, it's where they pierce themselves and they pray and they go fast for many days. And that tradition was outlawed when the Native Americans were put into the camps that they had to live in on the reservations. In 1977, I think, the year that we did this, or just the year before that, literally that year, it finally became legal for them to do their religious, in our country of religious freedom, for them to do their religious ceremony. And so Jamie Summers was really the first person. She ended up dating this Native American scientist, and Jamie Summers dated an Indian. Oh my gosh, it was like big stuff. So there was so many episodes that, because you were all kids watching it, probably meant nothing to you. If you go back and kind of watch certain things, you'll go, wow. But also not understanding what our culture was like then and how it was so restricted. I mean, today, who really, well, some people still have issues with mixed couples, but back then it was a big deal. And so I've been doing it all along. And so it just went on. I had now a bigger project and a whole subject, a whole 2 hours to talk about these different issues. So it wasn't that big of a change for me. I was just thrilled that we could do it overtly.
May I say something? As an African American, this woman, and a lot of people don't realize this, she had a little girl who was from Vietnam. She went to Africa in the 70s at a time where nobody went. Okay, so maybe white America wasn't talking about it, but my parents noticed that you went out with this Native American person and stuff. And that was, for us kids, really a big thing, because a lot of the kids you had on your show and in your classroom, white Americans didn't see on TV. They only saw, Beaver Cleaver and this, that, and the other. And that's why I think you have so many fans who are like African American and Asian and Native American, because you were inclusive at a time where there wasn't any. So if you can imagine never seeing a person of color on TV unless it was like the Jeffersons or an all-black comedy. And her show was like the first kids show that actually had other children and stuff. And I'm really, really grateful for that, because our generation saw that and then we acted upon that. I don't think there's as many hostilities with the kids who are the, I would say, Generation X as, say, the baby boomers. And it's a very important, I think it's very important to say that.
Thank you, yeah. It's always nice to hear that we actually, because we tried lots of things when we were making that series, and it was interesting as the demographic grew up, as the kids who watched it grew up. Then they started getting, before it's like, I want your autograph, or, I want you to be my mom. That kind of stuff. It's like, don't tell your mom that. And we worked so hard and we pushed so hard to be able to do these different kinds of stories that years later, when your generation got to be in their 20s and early 30s, I started hearing from people who, your age, that, and they were women, would tell me how it affected them. By the time a portion of the audience became in their 40s, the men started telling me, and it was like, I said, really, when did that come to you? And they said, oh, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And I said, wow, that's interesting. They said, but it took me to get this age before I had the guts to tell anybody that I used to watch The Bionic Woman. That I had a little sister, and I loved it. He said, and I said, well, what was it about it? What did you get from it? How did that impact you? And honestly, many men said, it's because it taught me, and I never thought about this. Honestly, I was hearing things that I didn't think about that might be a reaction, and he said that it taught me that I could be strong and sensitive in the same body. The same person could be strong and sensitive, even though I was a woman. The physical strength, I guess, in their mind equated to the male part of them, and I was blown away by that. That was something I never thought of. I was really pleased to hear. And the guys, most of them would say, I had a sister. So I would tell my friends, I have to go babysit for my sister now. I'll see you later. And they'd go home and watch The Bionic Woman with his sister. And then the other ones were just 12 and 14 and 15, and they just wanted to go watch The Bionic Woman, if you know what I mean. So, yeah. Anything else? I know we have to all go home at some point tonight.
We're talking about compassion. How do you see compassion now in your country? Because you were talking about compassion, and compassion is maybe the most important human value. And how do you see that value, compassion, in your country now?
Don't see it much. How do I see it? It's just a macrocosmic expression of what we talk about as individuals. The same theme that's going on there. It's needed more than ever right now. And various factions of people that have their own agenda are using the media to stimulate our lower self, to trigger that. It's not being used to raise our, they don't have to use the word consciousness, but to raise our frequency to where we can, it's like, well, suffice it to say that there's so much of the media that's being used in the U.S. I don't know what it's like here. I wouldn't presume to talk about it. But I can't imagine that some of that isn't being done. More so in some countries than others, but certainly in ours. And they're just splitting people apart. They're splitting families apart because people aren't remembering that the deeper essence of the self. They're only remembering the thoughts that they have. And the thoughts that they have are being programmed to them through the media, through these phones, through images that are constantly being put into your mind. Right and wrong, vote them off the island. To me, those particular shows, those competitive shows where the whole point of it, what is that called? Survivor, yeah. Survivor and all the Survivor's subsequent shows. I mean, it's fascinating for a minute, but when you realize what you're doing, when kids watch that, they're learning to exclude everyone but me. I have to be on the top of that pile. And so, and all of the shows that followed it, they're just kind of doing the same thing. I was happy to see a trend, because again, I see the media as just conditioning. Children and adults. Adults can still learn when they don't think they know everything. So, I don't know if that answers your question. We could talk about that for a month, probably, but is that it?
Thank you so much for the long talk to the audience.
have you here.
Thank you.